Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the differences we see between boys and girls in things like sports are just because of how they're raised, or if there is something more going on? Today we're diving into a fascinating debate about why boys and men, on average, are better at throwing than girls and women. Two scientists, Robert Diener and Michael Lombardo, looked at a viewpoint that says it is all about how we're taught, what we call socialization. They don't agree with that one bit. And they've written a strong response to a critique by another scientist, Fausto-Sterling. This is a really interesting clash of ideas about nature versus nurture. So, the big question here is, are the differences we see in how boys and girls throw, and by extension, potentially many other behaviors completely shaped by society, or is there a biological factor involved too? Scientists have generally agreed for a long time that it is usually a mix of both nature and nurture, like genes and environment working together. But it seems some folks in gender studies really lean heavily on the nurture, or socialization-only explanation. Diener and Lombardo are arguing that these socialization-only ideas, which they call a blank slate view, are ignoring a lot of important evidence. They're pushing back against the idea that if we see a difference between sexes, it must be because of how people are treated differently from birth. Now, Fausto-Sterling said that the idea that men evolved better throwing skills because they did more hunting or fighting in the past isn't realistic. Diener and Lombardo say, hold on a second, that is not quite what we argued, and even if it were, it is more complex than that. They actually say their main idea was that throwing likely evolved for combat, for fighting over tens of thousands of years. Hunting was a secondary reason, and in combat, especially warfare, males were historically much more involved than females. Fausto-Sterling apparently focused on the hunting part, which they say is just one piece of the puzzle, and not even their main point. They also tackled the man-the-hunter idea. There has been some recent pushback against the traditional view that men were the primary hunters. Some studies suggest women hunted a lot too, but Diener and Lombardo point to other researchers who have criticized these studies, saying they might have problems with how they collected data. They mention one study that found men's hunting was much more successful, bringing in way more meat, about 350 times more than women's. So, they argue that both combat and hunting could have put selective pressure on males to develop better throwing abilities. Next up, Fausto-Sterling questioned if the evidence for sex differences in childhood throwing is really that strong. Diener and Lombardo say it is stronger than she thought, and importantly, it is not the only evidence they presented. They acknowledge that some early studies on kids had small numbers of participants, but they say the difference in throwing skill was still huge. They also point out that even before puberty, boys are generally stronger in their upper bodies than girls. And interestingly, they found studies in places like Germany and Aboriginal Australia where you might expect socialization to be more similar for boys and girls, but the throwing difference between sexes was still there. This is where Diener and Lombardo get a bit frustrated. They feel Fausto-Sterling ignored a whole lot of other evidence they presented for males having specialized throwing adaptations. Let's list some of the other evidence they brought up. They looked at elite athletes in javelin throwing, where the sex differences are massive compared to other sports like shot put or jumps. They also examined differences in throwing accuracy, not just how far or fast someone can throw. They explored how prenatal hormone exposure, like androgens, which are often linked to male development, might play a role. Studies on girls with a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, who are exposed to higher levels of androgens before birth, show they tend to throw more accurately, suggesting a biological link. They also looked at how practice affects throwing. While practice helps everyone, it doesn't erase the sex difference. And even when they statistically adjusted for how much sports experience people had, the difference in throwing largely remained. They found that across many different cultures and types of societies, boys and men are just seen throwing much more often. This is a big one: anatomy. They found 9 distinct differences in the shoulder and pectoral girdle area that are linked to better throwing. These differences are almost always in favor of males. And 6 more anatomical features, like relative forearm length, also differ between sexes and seem to help male throwing. Even injuries show a difference. Females are more likely to get shoulder injuries from repetitive overhand throwing motions. They give the example of the glenoid fossa, the part of the shoulder socket. Males generally have larger ones, which allows for a greater range of motion for throwing, and this difference is seen even in young children. They found 8 studies showing this difference in adults, and males consistently had larger glenoid fossa. Now, Fausto-Sterling also suggests that because throwing skills aren't present at birth, they can be partly innate or evolved. Diener and Lombardo call this bizarre. They say many evolutionary adaptations, like walking or talking, don't appear right after birth, Development takes time. They also find it strange that when studies break down throwing into different components, like how much the hips and shoulders rotate, and then say that when you control for those technical aspects, the sex difference disappears, Fausto-Sterling implies the whole difference is just an illusion. Diener and Lombardo use an analogy. Would we argue men aren't taller than women because that difference vanishes if you only measure femur and tibia length after controlling for leg length? It doesn't make sense. Then, Fausto-Sterling presents her own small study of just 10 babies, ranging from 6 to 15 months old. She focused on 2 babies, Susie and Stephen, and observed their ball play. She noted Stephen was more involved with balls, developed techniques earlier, and received more ball-related interaction. She concluded that boys generally interacted with balls earlier than girls. Diener and Lombardo are not impressed. They say this tiny study, with just a handful of kids in one society, only suggests that maybe young boys get more encouragement with balls. It doesn't show that social interactions in general matter for development, or for overhand throwing specifically, which wasn't even observed in her study at all. And it certainly doesn't challenge the idea that innate predispositions, possibly influenced by hormones, also play a role. The core issue they see is that Fausto-Sterling treats evolution and development as if they're fighting each other. But to evolutionists, development is how adaptations happen. Genes, hormones, brains, and the environment, including social input, all work together. Evolution doesn't just create static blueprints, it shapes how things develop. They explain that parents are expected to socialize their kids in ways that help them succeed in their world. This often means channeling and amplifying natural tendencies. For example, even if boys everywhere are naturally more inclined to rough play due to hormones, societies might channel that tendency into sports or combat skills. So, their main point is that even if Fausto-Sterling had proven that social interactions contribute to the throwing difference, it wouldn't disprove their hypothesis that it is partly innate, because nature and nurture often work together and amplify each other. In conclusion, Diener and Lombardo feel they've shown that Fausto-Sterling's critique is weak. They suggest that if her arguments are the strongest ones against their idea of partly innate sex differences in throwing, then it actually makes their idea look stronger. They worry that this blank slate way of thinking, which ignores biology, is still really influential in many areas of sex and gender scholarship. They point to things like APA guidelines that attribute all differences to socialization, and even some textbooks that struggle to include an interactionist view. So, why does this socialization only view persist even with so much evidence that seems to contradict it? One possibility is that proponents of the blank slate idea just see the evidence differently, or they have very high standards for what counts as proof. But Diener and Lombardo suggest something more concerning, that for some proponents of the blank slate view, the actual evidence doesn't matter as much as protecting a preferred narrative. They argue that Fausto-Sterling ignored studies that directly challenge the socialization only idea rather than engaging with them. They conclude that when evidence that contradicts a belief is ignored instead of being discussed or refuted, the work stops being like genuine scientific exploration and starts becoming an effort to defend a particular story, even if the facts don't fully support it. The debate here is really important. It touches on how we understand ourselves, our gender, and the differences between us, Diener and Lombardo, are making a strong case for a more integrated understanding, where biology and environment are seen as partners, not enemies, in shaping who we are, including our skills like throwing a ball. It makes you think about how we interpret differences and whether we're truly open to all the evidence. What do you guys think? Does it seem like socialization alone can explain all the differences we see, or is there compelling evidence for biological influences too? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the fascinating world of the human mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.